What up? Welcome to Homegrown Hustle, where local brilliance takes the center stage. I'm your host, Matt Eickman. Together, we're about to embark on an inspiring journey. Our community thrives on the wisdom of insightful leaders that are right here in our backyard. And we're bringing their expertise to your ears. Whether you're an aspiring entrepreneur or simply seeking inspiration, this podcast is your guide. Join us every week in celebrating innovation, guidance, and the power to inspire greatness. Let's explore the stories that shape our local business landscape, and together, let's ignite the spark of excellence.
What's up, hustlers? I'm here with Gary Kramlich. He's the CEO of Otter Analytics. Really excited about this. He's got a great backstory. Went to West Point, spent a lot of time in the Army, worked at the Pentagon, and all that's led up to him working with businesses now to use data to make decisions and better understand what's going on behind the scenes. So, Gary, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit? Tell everybody your story.
Thank you, Matt. It's great to be here, right? I'm really excited to be part of the Homegrown Hustle podcast. I'm a big follower and I've been listening to it for a while. So it's exciting just to be here. Grew up in North Dakota, like I said, went to the military academy, and then out of the academy went into the infantry, was an airborne ranger for a nice solid years, and would have kept doing that until the Army decided I was better used to the Army as operations research. I was going to be an egghead. Mm-hmm. And as I've said before, it's sort of like getting picked to be the goalie on a hockey team, right? Like no one dreams about stopping pucks with their face. Mm-hmm. But when that's your job on the team, you get good at it. So I was a happy paratrooper, but they said, hey, you're going to go be an egghead. And
what's an egghead for everybody that isn't familiar with that?
So there's a lot of people that maintain databases. They're collecting data. They're measuring a bunch of stuff, and they put it into a database. That's a data head, in my view. Mm-hmm. An egghead is a guy that has to make some sense out of that. Like, tell me something that's, out of all the data that's out there, tell me something that's useful to the boss so they can make a decision. And I just appropriated the word so that people quit calling me that, awful name.
You just owned it. I just owned it.
I was like, they're going to call me an egghead. I'm going to call myself an egghead. And so I got to try to be the best egghead I could be, which is help the boss make a decision, right? If they're the only ones accountable, right? If they got to stand up in public or stand up in front of all the employees and say, hey, we got to do something. It's not going to be necessarily fun, but it's something that's necessary. They're going to make a decision when they're ready to make a decision, knowing that it's the right thing to do. Give them as much evidence that's useful to them to do it, right? Whether it be in a tactical unit, right? In Afghanistan, you're communicating progress that very often didn't look like progress. You're communicating back decision makers who have to go back to the American people because they're elected and explain these decisions to them. In the Pentagon, it's very much about justifying the things that the Army is going to need against everything that everyone else is asking for, both in the Air Force and the Navy, but also in Department of Agriculture, Department of Education. When the Army says, here's what we need, you have to justify that, which means you got to put a lot of good evidence why that investment was good for, my team versus everyone else who's out there, competing. So the best evidence wins, right? And so you got to bring that, and it's got to make sense. It's got to be persuasive. So out of there, decided to move up here to Minnesota. Like, my time for the Army it's a young man's game. So I got out and moved up here, and I do a lot of work for manufacturing, but where I was able to help local businesses. I really thought, these are the folks, these are the businesses, this is the location, that I wanted to help, right? Because it makes my community better. So it was one way of saying, businesses making money and making more money is always going to be good for the community that I live in. So, this is where I decided to live. And so that's what I'm helping with now.
That's awesome. So you're a data guy then. Would you call yourself that?
Sure. Yeah.
As well as an egghead. So when it comes to the data, like, I hear a lot of business owners when I'm talking with them, they're talking about data and numbers, and sometimes it seems to actually make sense and they understand their numbers, and sometimes they're kind of grasping for straws, almost trying to clutch onto something. And then there's those business owners where they just go off of feeling. So when you're talking data, the way I think about it is like driving success in a business, right? So success is it's a fluid word at times. So when you think about success for a business, how do you go about thinking about it? And then how do you work with the companies that you partner with to help them look at the right stuff?
Right. So, what I would counter to that, if I was talking to a skeptic, right, I would say, if you don't have the evidence, right, I'll steer away from the word data because they may hate that, right? I'll just say, listen, if you don't have the evidence, you're just giving me a strong opinion, right? And I would say, well, how do you know what you know? And for business owners that, they started this shop, they're running the shop, they're in there from opening to closing. I'm not going to tell them anything that they don't see and witness every day. I'm not going to try to compete with them. But in the world of online sales, in the world of a lot of things happening, online, there could be a lot of metadata that they're not seeing by the customers that walk in the door. They may see them pick up orders and walk out of the orders. What they don't know is how long did people dwell there? How long have they come in, filled out a basket?
The more granular parts of the journey.
That's right. And so if somebody's like, I know what I want, but I don't necessarily know the questions to ask to tease it, then I'd be like, okay, well, you already gave me kind of I can follow the rainbow to the pot of gold, which is, what does the boss want to know? If the boss has a certain number of decisions that they're considering, and they kind of know what they want to see to make that decision, right? The bottom line is always going to be, free cash flow and profit, right?
Yep.
Like, how many employees do I need? When should I buy a new lease in a new market? When are my products going to kind of sunset out because people want something new and flashy? These are all big commitments that the boss has to decide. So when do you know is the right time to make a change, right? When is it a good time to not make a change because what you have is better than what you might hope to get a harvest out of a new situation? I don't need someone to tell me the data that they have. I don't need people to tell me. I just need them to tell me what they want to know. I think the best advice I ever got from a boss, it certainly guided me as to how to be a good egghead for him, was when he said, Gary, I don't want to see the chart. I'll never want to see the data. I rarely want to see the chart. He's like, what does the chart tell you? He's like, that's knowledge. Like, when the chart's telling you something, Gary, come and tell me that. He said, but what I really want to know is what's making things go up or down, right? So when you figure out why things are happening and you know how to drive that line up or down, well, that's understanding. Come and give me that, because I can manipulate the environment, right? And so I just learned not to talk to my boss until I had something that was truly valuable to them, right? So if I had a boss that's like, Gary, I don't got a lot of time for A, B, C, or D, but I'm always interested in, how to cut costs. I'm always interested in when there's an opportunity out there that we need to pounce on. I'm always ready to understand when a market may not realize the return on investment that we hoped for, right? It's time to cut losses. So once they explain what keeps them up at night, once they explain the decisions that kind of weigh on their shoulders, then I can start there and say, okay, I'm going to go collect for these things that the boss wants to know. Because the boss is always trying to anticipate the future, trying to guess the things that may seem unknowable, right? But he or she wants to know, well, gosh, everyone's depending on me to make the right decision. And that decision weighs with, the pros and cons, the puts and takes, the trade-offs of what you got versus what you may get after. And so once they explain to me in their terms what they want more of or what they want less of, now I can use that to start to tease out the data that's going to help them see that. And so that they have more confidence when they got to pull the trigger.
Okay. So as you're talking, I'm just thinking about success in terms of like a mission, like Afghanistan you threw out there, right? So when you're talking about a mission that takes place, like how would you measure success for that? Because I don't see a lot of data points there other than did anybody get hurt, and Like what other data points would you be pulling out of something like that?
Okay, so Afghanistan, right? The military term was Operation Enduring Freedom. We were measuring the citizens' confidence in their government.
How do you measure that?
We did surveys. So I ran surveys. A great example is we were trying to measure people's economic success. And there were two funny things that came out of that. One, people wouldn't talk about how much money they make. Not with a stranger. It's just not their culture to talk about these things. But they would answer two questions. So one, I could get satellite data that showed me areas of parked cars, right? And I had this area over time, I would get these photos of this area. And I went from no parked cars to like one parking lot, which was a car dealership, to two parking lots, which was two competing car dealerships. And then there was a third parking lot, which was junk cars. And I had to say, well, I don't know how many cars are being sold and bought, but I know that if I have X number of cars on this lot, I can kind of say, well, there's some economic activity. Whether they be new cars or junk cars, there is money being changed hands when the number of cars in a given area is going up. So I could measure that in locales. But here was a survey question that we went about the wrong way. People wouldn't talk about how well they were doing financially. And I already said that. One thing they would talk about, and this was a cultural thing in the Pashtun culture, they would talk about their goats. So I learned not to ask how well they were doing. I would ask how their goats are doing. And so to walk, into a village, my surveyors would be like, so tell me about your goats. And they would go on and on and on about how many goats they had, because we're randomly selecting people. But they would tell me like, hey, my goats are doing better. And then we could take that. And then I would ask them other things. How do you think healthcare is going? Right. And they would say, oh, I can get to the clinic down the valley because the government has built a road. It didn't matter who paid for that road. And in many cases, the U.S. had helped with that. But if people were concerned about healthcare for their family, a road to the new clinic was a big indicator that the government was looking out for them. In places in the mountainous areas, that was the case. It wasn't the case in the flat highland areas, which are in the south. They would say, well, I'm worried about water. And so a road everything's flat already. They can drive where they want to. But if we gave them wells, and it turns out there's some really incredible artesian aquifers in Afghanistan, if we tapped into these aquifers, then that was feedback that those people would get. So we would turn around and say, hey, when people say what they're observing, and then we could correlate that to how they felt about the government, we could say, okay, things are working in one area because of one thing the government's doing. People are feeling good about the government for completely different reasons because of different efforts being made. And so you start to tailor what the government ought to be doing to help the people in a certain area. So
that went a very different direction than I thought it was going to. So when we're talking data, like, are you using AI at all as part of that?
I am not. I mean, I know what AI is doing. And certainly when you start to tease information out of, you have to collect the data, right? AI is not necessarily going to go find the data for you. So if you have, those things already built, AI can certainly help at a faster pace, do what are called neural nets, help to build kind of the black box. Like, hey, we know that we're seeing this. We're not necessarily why we're seeing it or which one of these things that we can count are a factor. And so AI is able to pull that out in a much faster pace. So anybody who's trying to make sense out of, data clouds is going to be using AI just because it helps you do your work faster. But if you don't know what question to tell AI to answer, it's not going to tell you the answer.
It'll tell you something, but
it'll tell you something, but it'll be like, how are your goats? And it doesn't know what to tell. It doesn't, out of context, AI is not going to make sense of that. You'd have to tell it, hey, I'm trying to, sense Afghanistan economic well-being, right? So you have to know the question, which is always the human part, right? Like, what does the boss want to know to make the decision? Okay, now you can use AI to help get that answer faster, but you got to know the right question to begin with.
So you've said teasing info a few times. How would you coach a small business owner or a leader of a business on some questions to kind of tease that info out for themselves?
So a small business owner that's starting to look at the data, in my case, what I've observed is when they're no longer in one shop that they're, manning, 2 shifts, 3 shifts a day. They're now past the point where they're running the traps in a given week, right? They have multiple offices. They have so many employees that they just don't get to see every day to get a sense of what's got. So at some point, their manager's got to report in, whether it be a weekly basis or so forth. Or there's so many shops out there, they're getting data reports in, maybe by online sales, or they're just able to pull that out of their booking systems. But they don't have time to sit and make sense of it, right? Yeah. And that's where a business owner would turn to an egghead and say, listen, I don't got time to look at the data and make charts out of it, or look at the chart until it tells me something. Pay someone, even if it's just a couple hours a week. Hey, go make sense of this and come and tell me what is on the horizon. And that's what I call going from the what to the so what. And most business owners would say, well, if it was just me in my one shop, I know what's going on and I can make sense of it, which is the so what. But when you start to say, well, what's next, right? What to so what to what's next? Tell me what's around the horizon that I should anticipate for. What I have, again, to talk about like my example of GPS, right? I have a GPS on my phone and I use it when I was driving here today. And at the bottom, it tells me when I'm going to arrive and what's the total distance until I arrive here. But that's not the part of the data thing that's on that screen. What I'm looking at, most importantly, is the next turn, right? When am I going to take energy? When am I going to get off the road that I'm on and I'm going to start making a turn and to get on a different road? For a business, this would be like, hey, everything's running. How do I decide to, get to the right lane, slow down, put my signal on, navigate oncoming and offcoming traffic to then take my organizational energy. When a boss decides to do that, they're causing disruption in their business, right? They got to explain this to their employees, to their managers. They got to understand like, hey, here are the rubber balls. We can let these things drop, and here are the glass balls. These are the things we can't let go, right? So you would say customer service, right? Like you're never going to sacrifice customer service, in the grand scheme of things. So when a boss knows what they want to see, right? And they're able to communicate that down to their managers, they're able to communicate that to their employees. They can explain the disruption that's going to be a temporary thing and why that is good in the long haul, right? How that meets the company vision. And again, justifying that and knowing that things are unfolding the way that they wanted it to is where someone's like, yep, I knew that this was going to be a rough patch, right? There are going to be some slowdown or some speed ups or some rumble strips along the way, but this is all coming out the way you wanted it to. And so what I find is even if someone's like, well, I'm not a data head, I don't need this stuff to make my decisions. And I would be like, well, maybe your boss's boss needs to make this decision. And so for a small business, you would be like, I don't need this. I know when I know, but well, what if you got to convince a city council to rezone a parcel of land that you want to buy? Well, you got to convince them. You got to get them to yes. A lot of city councils want to see something beyond, again, jazz hands and shadow puppets to convince them to rezone a section of land because that matters to the citizens.
You got to do better than pretty please.
That's right. Right. Like, again, their minds can be changed, but bring them evidence that gets them to yes. And so my view as an egghead says, hey, I'm not happy until my boss is really excited to hand off my work either to their boss or to whoever they wanted this to be done for, right? Even if they don't need it themselves, sometimes they just needed to convince the next person, that they're negotiating with to get to yes. So if you're going to a bank for funding, right, you want a line of credit, you got to show that bank, hey, that things are rolling the way that you are. You got a stability plan. So despite economic downturns or what have you, that you're a low risk bet for their financing. Okay, well, you better bring some evidence to that argument. And that's where not just your comptroller and your financial managers are going to help you, but you can take a guess, but the evidence is going to be really helpful, right? When you have to convince someone who also has evidence, that you're having that conversation based on the facts that you can agree on, right? And then you can negotiate on the things you don't.
So you work with a lot of larger manufacturing, right? And they're with different expansions and things like that. And there's data that's there. And I'm sure that there's multiple parties interpreting it. Like, how often are different interpretations coming from the same data? And then why?
Great. So one of my favorite metaphors, it's not mine, but it's been around for 3,000 or so years, is the 6 blind monks looking at the elephant. And
never heard that one.
You haven't? Okay. So there's 6 blind monks looking at an elephant. The one who's holding on to the trunk says, hey, the entire elephant is very much like a snake. You know, it's supple and it moves around. It can grab things on the end. And there's one monk, also blind, touching the tusk. And he's like, it's nothing like that at all. Right? It's hard and it's sharp and it's like a spear. The elephant is like a spear. And there's a monk holding on to the ear and he's like, no, it's more like a palm tree. It's flat and it moves around. And another monk's on the leg and says, no, you guys are all crazy. It's like a tree trunk. You know, the elephant's like a tree trunk. And another one's on the side, says it's like a wall. And there's one on the back end, the unlucky monk who's holding onto the tail is like, no, it's short and bristly like a broom. The neat thing about this is each one of those monks has perfect but short-sighted information, right? So when your problem is multifaceted, when it can be looked at from financials, from operations and production, from a supply chain management, from a human resources, and then, bottom line, just is this profitable? You're going to get different views of a very multifaceted, complex situation, right? So how do you bring all these blind monks together to say, hey, guess what? You're all right. I can look at this problem from a number of different angles. None of y'all are wrong, right? In the poem, in the proverb, these monks are all arguing with each other, and until they're listening to each other to understand what they're missing, not what they see. When they understand what they're missing, they can fill in the image of what the entire elephant or the business problem is. So if you're going to expand your business and you're saying, hey, we're going to, tear down this wall and we're going to bump it out and we're going to put a new production line here or put some new dock doors over there, a new drop lot over there. People are going to go, well, that's awful. That's the worst thing I've ever heard, because that's going to disrupt,
it's different. It's a disruptor.
That's right. So how do you get people past that, right? How does a boss say, hey, all of y'all have useful information. We want to blend that together to make sense of what is a very complex, multifaceted business plan, a business problem. Let's get to yes, right? Let's build consensus. So 6 blind monks looking at the elephant all have a different opinion of what that thing really looks like. They're all correct, but they were ignoring each other's information, and so they were missing a lot. And so for a boss to say, hey, this is what I'm sensing, tell me what I'm missing. What I find is that, if a business has a business plan, if they have a business strategy, sometimes things aren't going the way that they thought, right? I'm driving from my home in Forest Lake down to here. When I had a route to get here, it gave me a couple different routes, and I'm taking it. And based on what I could tell when I left my house, I was going to get here in a certain amount of time. Well, what developed along the way was a traffic jam, right? And I suddenly had to come up with a plan to get around it. And GPS was really helpful. But the idea is that things are going to happen along the way, right? The things that we thought to be true don't turn out to be true. And so when people have a plan, but now it's time to figure out what's not working in the plan, what I found is that there's some questions to be asked. And I call those gap seams, shortfalls, and opportunities. It's very similar to what people may have learned as SWOT, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But for a business that has a business plan, I do this gap seams and shortfalls because when you're talking to the managers, like this is below the boss, below the board of directors, below the partners, you're saying, hey, listen, here's our plan. Here's what we want to have happen. Here's where we want to be. You say, where do you not have the authority to do what you're being tasked to do? Or where do you not really know what right looks like? I call that a gap, right? And people will tell you, they're like, I don't really know what the boss means when he says X. I don't know what he means when he says Y. Like he says it, and there's a lot of jazz hands and shadow puppets. So I don't want to argue with them because I might be missing something, but I don't get it. And so let's write those down. To me, those are gaps. Those are where the leadership needs to clarify, or they need to empower somebody to be like, yeah, I'm entrusting Matt to do this thing. I'm going to give Matt the ability, the power to do that on his own. if you have all of those figured out, then you get into this part that I call a seam, which is I know what I need to do and I'm empowered to do it, but I can't make my co-managers, I can't make my counterparts do it. Right. And so you actually need the boss. This all goes back to the boss. I need the boss to orchestrate. Right. I know how to play my instrument. If this was a band, I know how to play my instrument, but these guys are playing at a different tempo in a different key. Right. You need the boss here to orchestrate and to synchronize. Right. So where do I have a seam between me and someone else? This could be like human resources and production. This could be one branch manager and another branch manager in kind of areas that are growing together because the community is growing. So, but you need the boss to basically play conductor, referee, and they can't do it amongst themselves. You know, you could be like, hey, hug it out, slug it out. But it's better when a boss just says, hey, I'm gonna orchestrate these things. You know, we're all gonna be on the same sheet of music. Let me conduct music. We're all in the same key and the same tempo. So that's gaps and seams. And then the shortfall is everything else is kind of sorted out, but I'm gonna run out of manpower, time, or money. Right? I can't generate my own manpower, time, or money. The boss actually has to afford those to me to say, hey, maybe there's a little bit extra time. He, you know, can wait on things. And where I've identified those for my boss, now the boss can go do something that he knows is a problem. And he alone, or maybe the leadership, board of directors or partners have to figure out how they want to solve it. But the neat thing is, kind of like the 6 blind men at the elephant, like, hey, we know that we're only seeing part of the problem. You can survey your managers and you'll get that answer pretty quick. When I have a list of that for our company, again, generated at that kind of right below the lead, you know, the decision level, they're really happy to tell you these things. Like they're always happy to tell you the things that are beyond their control where they need the boss to like step in. And the boss can figure out how that wants to happen. If one of the other parts that I bring out of that is risk, right? Which is a word that I think is thrown around a lot. To me, it means what's going to go wrong and what's the impact, the consequence of that going wrong. What's the likelihood it goes wrong? So if you say, hey, we're going to develop this product, there's a 10% chance that it's wildly successful, 80% chance that it's, you know, marginally successful, pays for itself, and 10% chance that it doesn't. You can start to say, well, what's the payoff, right? What's the risk and balance? But when people talk about risk, again, I sense that there's a lot of jazz hands and shadow puppets in that conversation, right? Because it can mean anything. To me, it's a bad thing happening, and then how bad does it really get? And this gets into the discussion of black swans and so forth. And the other thing, when you start to say, well, what's not going right? You know, and we've talked about gap seams and shortfalls. The other thing I put in there is opportunities. And I define that as, boss, I could get something done faster or wider if you let me stop doing something you've already told me to do, right? Allow a glass ball to turn into a rubber ball, meaning if I skip it once a week or once a month or whatever, but where the boss has given you a task in the past, you're juggling balls with one hand, and now he wants you to juggle balls. At some point, you're like, if I can drop some of these things and use both hands, meaning take the time, manpower, resources, you're doing an existing thing and apply this to this thing that's more important. If the boss gives you permission to do that, you know, suddenly you got what you need. You can maybe cover a shortfall. So I build this up into a quad chart. You know, it makes a nice PowerPoint thing where you list it out for the boss and you say, hey, here are the gap seams and shortfalls, and here's what you got to do to kind of get after that. People go, oh, I have a sense of what my managers are dealing with, where they think that this is a problem the leadership can and should solve versus something that, you know, they would like to do on their own. You don't need agreement, right? It's kind of like that, hey, here are all the edges of this problem. Here are all the different angles on the elephant. And that, you know, you can have a conversation there because you're focused on the things that aren't necessarily being great. You're not necessarily, you know, talking about just straight success.
So success and measuring that, obviously that's critical to understanding whether or not an initiative is going well. But what about like progress? The way I think about it, that's something that's measured over time, and success is a function of that. When you talk about progress for a particular business initiative, how do you go about measuring that? And is there any point where there's a pivot or or a change in defining that success because of the progress?
I don't define it, right?
Okay.
I mean, in my interviews, right, or looking at the vision statement that the boss has said, because if you're talking about a family business, right, they've been doing things, they have a reputation about the way they do business, and they're not going to squander that reputation to do something too fast, right? Or something that would cause their customers to say, something's changed in that company. They just don't care about their customers anymore. I'm not going to define success, right? Beyond the idea that, hey, at the end of the day, it's about free cash flow, right? Like if you're not making money, it's a charity, right? So if you got to make money and call it a business, at the end of the day, revenue has to exceed costs. And so where someone's like, I'm making money. At the end of the day, I am profitable, but here are the other things I don't want to squander, right? You don't want your employees to be so aggravated working for you that they decide it's better to work somewhere else. You want to keep turbulence low. Or I don't want to get into a lease that somehow doesn't work and I got to pay off this lease, even though the business is no longer viable in that area, right? So you would start to say, well, I don't want to lose money, right? So how do I know that I'm going to be making money? I might make $0 profit at the end of all of this. I don't want to make negative dollars after all of this. I can't define that for a business because I think every business, depending on the market, the location, the service that they're providing, and the reputation that they want to maintain along the way, they have to explain that for themselves. I can just help them understand the trade-offs, right? When you start to connect the numbers of what, hey, this costs versus what the payoff is going to be, customer service takes money to do right. It's going to take time. It's going to take energy from you, the boss, the owner, whoever's answering the phone, the person that has to take a ration of grief, right? From the aggravated customer. These are all things that you have to, maintain. But at some point you can't put 100% of your company's energy into customer service. You got to actually get done, right? So if you're talking about people, processes, products, right? You're always kind of juggling these things to make sure that none of them fall. And it's a matter of like, well, I use the metaphor of spinning plates, like the guy in the circus. Like sometimes they just need a touch to not get wobbly, right? Some you have to keep spinning a lot because you've been way too long. So as a boss, how are you going to spin all your plates to keep them all balanced? If you ignore them, they get wobbly and they fall off, and that's not good. But sometimes they just need a touch. And so how do you do that? Well, to help them understand where things are going right, and you don't need to put a lot of energy into that. Or do you have a capable manager who's handling that for you because you've empowered them? You may not need to do much, but it doesn't mean you can ignore it entirely, right? You gotta take a look at it. And that's where, if you're managing something, you're counting and you're measuring something, right? And so getting that right balance where you're not overburdening the people that have to report to you, but you're getting enough insight as often as you feel you need it so that you're in that right spot.
So you talked about product, people, and processes. So processes within a small business, sometimes they're there and they're solid and it's almost second nature. And sometimes it's fluid, especially within the customer service area. So let's say you got the same business, right? And you're going to analyze it in two scenarios. One scenario, processes are smooth. Everyone runs the same scripting, handles the customer interaction the same way. The other one, it's kind of based off the people and they kind of feel it out and handle it however they handle it. When you're talking about driving a result for that business in those two scenarios, how much does that process really impact and allow you to measure the data?
Right. So you'll try to map the process in every case, right? Like there's all kinds of ways to map a process, right? And that's pretty simple systems engineering. Part of that process is how much of that is dependent on the person doing it. I have a great example of where I witnessed this in the Army, right? But too long story to get into now, but at some point you have to ask yourself, could I replicate this? Or, kind of what happened if this person just doesn't come to work tomorrow? Kind of vulnerability, right? You may find that, my process is going great. When everybody's there, it runs as smooth as silk. But you could start to ask yourself, what would happen if that person didn't show up today? right? It's kind of that chess piece. Like, well, what happened if that chess piece is gone? The rest of this, does it function? And where you find that, hey, you got this one person who's the cornerstone of the arch, or excuse me, the keystone of the arch or the cornerstone of the building. If that person can't be replicated, if there's nobody that knows how to do that person's job, that's something a boss has to think about, right? Like the cemeteries are full of indispensable people, right? Like they were all indispensable at some point, right? And you have to figure out that, hey, at some point as a boss, to have a resilient, stable business, even the boss is replaceable. And there's kind of this, are you training your replacement? In the Army, it's unfortunately, something we have to do. Like you got to be training your replacement all the time. So we put a lot of energy into that kind of training thing. For a boss, it's like, hey, everything's going fine. My question would be like, if I took everybody out of here, we had one of these Thanos moments, right? 50% of your people are gone. How long would it take you to train the other 50% to get back up to where you're going, right? If the question is like, well, I can't replace this guy, I can't replace this guy, well, then your process is pretty brittle, right? You better put some more time and energy into training, right? Google has a Google Friday thing where they all kind of get to do something different, and at least in some really good cross-pollination. But I think every business has to say, everyone here is going to be replaced at some point. Like we call it retirement. It's a success of a happy career. What am I going to do at that point, right? Because no business should stop just because of one person's retirement.
For sure. So are there things that you have learned through being part of the military that you're still applying in business that aren't necessarily the data or the egghead related stuff, but the other structure that comes with that?
Yeah. One is never take it personally, right? Like there's what I would say is, don't let your boss's bad day be your bad day, right? If your ego and your position are too closely intertwined, right? Your boss is going to have a bad day and you're going to have a crushing day, right? So there's always this thing that my boss is going to have a bad day. He's going to be tired. He's going to be irritable. He's going to feel sick. He's going to be hungry, right? And he's going to snap at me. And I just learned that, man, I don't let my boss's bad day be my bad day. I let them basically speak out loud without thinking it was always spoken to me. You've seen plenty of movies where, people are pointing fingers and yelling and foaming at the mouth and pounding on the table. There are those moments in every business, but you let your boss speak out loud or think aloud, right? When I let my boss think aloud, saying, here's the thing that really gets under my skin. This drives me to distraction. I've hit a moment there, even though I might be kind of under the heat lamp, right? To say, this is a thing that really concerns them. And if I, as an egghead, can bring some evidence, some data, whatever it may be, that helps them understand this thing better. Those moments when I'm really under the gun are those moments that I get the best information out of somebody because what's really bothering them. Now, you hopefully get that by just making a polite question and you get a polite answer. But where I get moments where someone is really having a bad day and they're taking it out on me, I actually get the best understanding of what my boss wants me to do. So I would say having a lot of those moments and having the scar tissue from the military, unfortunately at West Point, your first day is really bad. Everyone's yelling at you. And it kind of follows that track for the first year. Plebe year is what we call it, right? Your plebe year is a lot of people yelling at you for no good reason. In hindsight, no good reason. But you have one of these days, you're like, man, I'm not going to let that guy's bad day be my bad day. And so you just learn to say, I'm going to,
gotta make that decision that it's going to be a good day, regardless of
that's right,
whatever's going on.
Right. My mind
that's
has
good life advice right there.
Yeah. You have the power to make hell of heaven and heaven of hell, right? It's not anyone else's choice how you view things.
That's good. What's your favorite story from going to West Point?
My worst day and my best day are at the same moment. I was a senior and I had punishment tours, and which means you have to get dressed up in your full dress uniform and then you walk back and forth with your weapon for an hour. And if you have a small offense, you'll get 2 hours.
What did you do?
I missed a formation.
It sounds like a big deal.
It wasn't a big deal. Like if you have a drinking violation, if you get driving under the influence, you're talking 100 hours, 130 hours, right? You lost every weekend for 6, 7, 8 months, right? So I had a pretty minor infraction. Unfortunately, it was during Labor Day. And what I realized is that if I sat my tours, which was I got to, as a senior, I could sit my tours, but you have to do it 2 for 1. So I'd have to sit all day, Friday and Saturday. If I walked them, I could be done in just 2 hours. And because I wanted to go to the baseball game, I decided to walk them. And so I did, right? And I didn't have to. So I'm the only guy out there that has to walk the tours, right? But I got done in enough time that I was able to jump on the train. You're just north of New York City. Yep. And I got to go to a Yankees baseball game, right? That went into extra innings. It was Don Mattingly's last season. We snuck into the first base section, and we got to watch Don Mattingly, who had grown up watching play his last season, one of his last games of his last season, because it's September. And because we're in New York City, and we're like, well, what else is going on in New York City? It turns out a New York Minute's got a lot in it. We took the subway out to Flushing, and we watched 2 super U.S. Open tennis matches. Right? Like all in one day. And we were able to jump on the train, get back home and get home in time for us not to get in trouble. And so I had this like low high and then super high moment where I was getting punished, and that's supposed to be embarrassing. And, you feel shame, and it's like sitting in the penalty box at a hockey game. Right. And then I got to have a great day that again was better because I snuck into the better seats at 10th inning. And then I topped it all off by seeing 2 great matches that I had no idea I'd get to see at the US Open. And to have that all in 1 minute, but I'll tell you, your best day as a cadet is still lower than your worst day as a lieutenant. Like when you get to graduate and you're really in the Army and you're a real paratrooper, your best day here is still lower than your, worst day here. So it's kind of those highs and lows where you go, yeah, it was all worth it. I'm glad I'm not there anymore. But it was, I learned a lot along the way.
Yeah, what an awesome experience. I've been to that campus, done a bat inspection on one of the churches there, actually. It's
really?
Yeah.
There's
great. So much history there, and it's the biggest, it's big. And where it's at on the river there, it's like there's some history behind why it was built there, right? And just I'm kind of a history nerd, so it was cool to just go there. One of my good friends actually does the pest control for West Point, so got to see the pest control version of the tour. So anyway, away from West Point, we got a couple minutes left here. Are there any tips or tricks within like Excel that people could learn from, like easy ones, anything that would help? Because everybody sucks more than you do. I'm positive.
So, the vertical lookup function where you have a table on one page and then you have to look up something to put it onto another page, right? It's your simple database lookup, but in Excel, it's called the V lookup or H lookup for vertical and horizontal lookup functions. If you just knew how to do those 2 functions, which are not common, you could feed your family for your whole career. Right?
Is there a keyboard shortcut?
Oh, sure.
What is it?
I mean, you just put V and it'll start to say V lookup, right? Or you put in H and it'll be like H lookup. Because people can get data from anywhere. It's a matter of like lacing it together to make sense out of it. And the way that you do that in Excel is, the V lookup function. And
that's good to know.
And so I just say, hey, if you got a database, if you got an Excel spreadsheet, I can start moving furniture around your room with it, right? And it's not hard, right? I'm a simpleton, so I've learned to do these things. It's just a matter of like making it, again, make sense for the boss.
So when a couple more questions, then we're going to have to cut it. But so when things aren't going well, how do you identify and fix things within a business?
So the gap seams and shortfalls is the one that I would say, opportunities, right? Because that's going to tell the boss a lot. What I also find is that there's a lot of people that will disagree on the priorities of things, right? How do you get a company to look at their priorities? What I've offered to people, I like to say this in any group that I'm in, I'll go into a group and I'll say, hey, half of y'all are below average. And people, they'll look provoked, like they're, like they're ready to pick a fight. I'll be like, no, it's mathematically true. If I'm counting age, shoe size, time on the job, distance to their home, if I can count it, I can rack and stack it from high to low, and I can draw a middle line. So half of y'all are always going to be below average. Doesn't matter what I'm counting. Doesn't mean something's bad. It just like if I can count it, I can measure it, and I can stack it. So if I look at things that a business is doing, products, sales, I can count it, and I can rack and stack it. And there's going to be this median line. And I'm going to be able to say, okay, if it's priorities, if I need to talk about time and energy and manpower, and I have the most important thing to the lowest important thing, the things on the bottom half should pay for the things on the top half. It doesn't mean this is zero, right? These are all zero and that becomes 100%. But when I start to talk about where am I going to take time and power and money, I got to take from somewhere and I got to put it somewhere, right? And so that was what I did in the Army. Like, again, big portfolio, lots of, things to fight about. And we did, argue about them extensively. But in the end, I would always say, hey, half of y'all are below average. The things on the bottom half are going to pay for the things on the top half. And so getting people to come together and do that is it's a thought. It only takes an hour, right? I can walk folks through it, because you get them to put their priorities in boat. And then what I do is there's a process that I say, okay, I want something that is inclusive, meaning everyone has a vote. It's transparent, meaning I can see what everyone else is voting. It's flexible, meaning I could adjust things when I need to. It's repeatable, meaning I could do it year after year. And it's expandable. I could do it in one branch, and then I can also meld that with other branches. So that's the process of, again, for a company that's going to have different views on things, different departments, are going to view these things in different ways. I can rack and stack these things. So when a company starts to say, we know we need to put more manpower and money here, where do we take it from? I can start to say, well, here are your options. You're going to take from the lower things to apply to the higher things. And here's where this thing starts to be not viable. And here's where this thing starts to be more successful. Just allowing people to have those options to trade means, hey, they got a lot of choices that are informed. They'll make the choice. I'm just here to kind of give them the evidence, right, that helps them make that choice in confidence.
For sure. Well, I want to thank you for your time, for coming out here. That went quick. Real quick, anybody who is interested in working with you, what's the best way for them to get in contact with your business? So
Otter Analytics, with the S on the end, at iCloud.com, right? I don't have a website. It's just, my email address. So Otter Analytics at iCloud.com is my email. And I'll come to you, right? If it's a matter of sitting in and listening to things and then giving you an idea, I'm always happy to help. I'm always curious with what businesses may need help with, right? So a conversation is always going to come free, right? And then we'll talk about, what things cost down the line once I've proven my value. But, the conversation's always going to be welcome. Awesome. Well, I want to thank you again for coming on the Homegrown Hustle podcast. Thank all of you for listening and following us. We really appreciate all the support. If you think this was valuable, feel free to share it with somebody, give it a like. And thank you again for all the support. Until next time, keep hustling.
Are you dealing with pest or wildlife issues on your property? Call us at 763-328-0156 or scan the QR code to learn more.
Thanks again for joining us on Homegrown Hustle. Our local business community thrives because of the brilliant leaders right here in our backyard. And it's been an absolute privilege to provide them with a platform to share their invaluable expertise. Stay tuned for more insight, wisdom, and inspiration from our local business champions. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Together, we'll continue to nurture and expand our homegrown success stories. Matt Eickman signing off until our next insightful episode.